Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. As a kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the 90s, our family loved to tell spooky stories. We'd sit out on the stoop at night and listen as the adults talked about ghosts, aliens, doppelgangers, talking cats, and more. In some way, these stories were my earliest introduction to the paranormal. Before the love for horror movies, R.L. Stine and Stephen King, and long before the Red Treehouse, I had these stories. As creeped out as they made me feel, it's terrifying to hear at 8 years old about the ghost who lived upstairs from you. What scared me most was the threat of the boogeyman, who we, as Puerto Ricans, referred to as El Cuco. Like so many other versions of the boogeyman, El Cuco was brought up mostly when I was acting up. And it was always like a warning. You better stop, or El Cuco will get you. Even though this was often said in jest, and even though I knew it back then, El Cuco always scared me. In my mind, he was this all-powerful entity that could snatch me up at a moment's notice. It's why I ran from the bathroom back to my bed in the middle of the night, or refused to stick my foot out from under the covers, or avoided sleeping with my back to a door. You just never knew when or where he would show up. And that was truly scary. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the terrifying legend of El Cuco, the Puerto Rican Bogeyman. What makes this monster so scary? And does he really snatch unruly children, or is he nothing more than a tall tale? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. It's a near universal truth that legends about the boogeyman exist all over the world. And while these monsters take on different forms and have unique backstories, the boogeyman stands as a reminder of the power of folklore and oral tradition. In many Spanish-speaking countries, the boogeyman is known as El Coco, though the specific name varies from country to country and culture to culture. Other variations of El Coco include Coca, Cucuy, Cuca, Cucu, Cucui, and of course, El Cuco. Despite the variations in name and details, there is a terrifying reality that ties them all together. El Coco is a child eater. In the most technical sense, the word coco in Spanish means coconut. On the surface, this hardly seems like a scary name for a terrible child-eating monster. Except when you think about what a coconut looks like. Coconuts have 3 indentations on the surface, called germination pores, that when turned face up, look like a face, 2 eyes, and a nose or mouth. El Coco, then, is not a reference to a coconut, but rather a skull. Though it's near impossible to determine the origins of El Coco, one article offered helpful insight. Quote, the earliest known reference to El Coco comes from 1518 and an allegorical play written by poet and playwright Gil Vicente, The Act of the Ship of Purgatory, and the use of El Coco is in reference to the devil. End quote. This means El Coco has been stalking and terrorizing children across the world for centuries. And here's the thing. You don't need to be of Hispanic or Portuguese descent, or speak Spanish or Portuguese to become a victim. Because El Coco, quote, gets around by language and culture. So anywhere with people who speak Spanish, Portuguese, or Galician is susceptible to attacks by El Coco. End quote. According to one article, the oldest known rhyme about El Coco was written in the 17th century. Quote, sleep, child, sleep or else. Coco will come and eat you. End quote. A Portuguese lullaby implores Coca to leave. Quote, leave, Coca. Leave, Coca. Go to the top of the roof. Let the child have a quiet sleep. End quote. And a Brazilian lullaby tells of the Cuca. Quote, sleep, little baby. That Cuca comes to get you. Daddy went to the farm. Mommy went to work. End quote. In some cultures, El Coco took on a specific form. One article described the variations. Quote, glowing red eyes from under your bed or in your closet. Mouth full of razor-sharp teeth like a barracuda. A hairy beast atop the roof. Long claws like knives. Some say it is a vaguely female, humanoid alligator, or has an empty pumpkin for a head. Some say it is the dark shadow of someone who recently died. End quote. As if this weren't scary enough, El Coco was believed to have paid attention to misbehaving kids, and at an opportune time, come down from its cave or den to, quote, snatch them up, toss them into a bag, and witch them back to its lair. In the darkness, El Coco tears into the children, feasting on their flesh and leaving no trace of them behind. End quote. Coming from Puerto Rican heritage, I grew up aware of El Cuco, our own version of the monster. From what I remember, El Cuco wasn't a creature or humanoid. Instead, he was shapeless and devoid of form, a sort of shadowy specter who hid in closets, under your bed, or in the darkest corners of the room, just waiting for the right time to snatch you away. Like most kids, I could be unruly and misbehave. And like most kids, I sometimes refused to go to sleep, often staying awake in my bed for hours before finally dozing off. There were times when my dad and grandparents especially would make a passing reference to El Cuco. Not so much an overt threat, like El Cuco will come to get you, but more like, you know what happens if you don't go to sleep, right? And that's the thing. I don't ever remember having a close encounter with El Cuco, at least not directly. But I remember the fear he evoked in me, because it was possible. he could get me. One article captured this feeling. Quote, "It starts when we're young. A mother would scold her stubborn child, trying to beckon them to go to sleep when it's way past their bedtime. If you don't go to sleep, El Cuco will come and eat you." This sentence was enough to get any child to zoom towards their bed and duck under the covers, promising to go to sleep. Perhaps the parents knew better than to believe in the silly myth, but the children would hide under their blankets, peeking out when they heard the sound of scratching against the floor under their bed. End quote. Even though I grew up hearing all about El Cuco, I never had a direct encounter with the monster. Looking back, I can recall certain times when I felt afraid or spooked for no good reason. And there's a part of me now, as an adult, that thinks the fear was due to El Cuco, at least subconsciously. I don't think El Cuco was actually making me feel scared, as much as the thoughts I already had about El Cuco led to my feeling afraid. Except, there was one time, and one story my dad told me over the years, that have left me wondering. When I was a kid, we lived in a multi-family home near Sunset Park, Brooklyn. We lived on the ground floor, and the landlord and his wife, the owners of the home, lived just above us on the top floor. One time, they went on vacation and asked my dad to get their mail and place it upstairs in their apartment while they were gone. I don't remember how long they were supposed to be away, but one night, my dad heard footsteps in their apartment. At first, he thought the landlord was home early from vacation. But as time went on, he noticed the footsteps were heavy, like someone was walking around in boots. This was concerning, because the landlord and his wife were an elderly couple and would not have been walking around in boots, especially at night. Worried someone had broken in, my dad grabbed a baseball bat and walked upstairs to their apartment. A minute or two later, he came running down. There was no one up there. The lights were off. The mail was where he'd placed it. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. Spooked but relieved no one had broken in, he sat down to watch television. A few minutes later, he heard something strange. The creaking of a rocking chair moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then, the sound of someone standing up and walking around in the apartment. Within a few seconds of hearing it, he grabbed the bat again and ran upstairs, convinced he would catch whoever had broken in red-handed. And just like before, he came running back downstairs a minute or two later. There was no one up there. The lights were off. The mail was where he'd placed it. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. As a kid, I heard this story and just about shit my pants, especially since our family moved into the upstairs apartment a short time after this happened. Over the years, I'd forgotten it. But in the months before my dad passed away, he told me the story again, which was confirmed by my mom as being true. And while we all believed there was something haunting the house, I wonder now if it might have been El Cuco, walking, stalking, and waiting. As I was researching and writing this episode, I came across a terrific short creepypasta, It Comes, posted on the Creepypasta Wiki. Unfortunately, there was no author listed, but you can find a link to the source in the show notes. It Comes. Please forgive the length of this message. This is possibly the last ever time I'll have access to a computer, so I thought I'd better write this all down while I can, and get it to those who should know. I'm leaving town. I don't know where I'm going. I'm just getting as far away as I can. So, as some of you may know, I opened up a shop a little over a year ago. It was doing decently, but not the way I wanted. Still, I'm not going to be ungrateful about it. I've always been grateful to all of my customers who would come to me exclusively, when God knows there are so many already established places in town. I've been doing well enough that I was able to hire on my buddy Lewis a few months ago, and he's been working hard and helping out really well, as I always knew he would. One night, I decided to have my buddy Lewis over at my house since my wife was out of town for the weekend. That's the day I think everything actually started, because when I got back from my shopping, something seemed strange with Lewis. He had oil all over himself. Some of it was even smeared across his face, as if he tried to drink it. I told him to go home and clean himself up, because we had no towels or anything to clean himself up with. He came back 45 minutes later, but he was still much quieter than usual. He worked as well as he ever did, but something just seemed off about him. I asked him if anything happened while I was out, and he just shook his head. I asked again if something happened, and he nodded his head and muttered something unintelligible. I asked him to repeat himself, and he turned and glared at me. For the briefest moment, I could have swore his eyes appeared to be completely black. No iris, no sclera, just utter, all-consuming blackness. I stumbled back and bumped a shelf, knocking things down. When I looked back at him, he was still looking at me, but he didn't seem to be glaring hatefully the way he had before. He just seemed kind of out of it. I assumed his car needed to be oiled and that he'd just accidentally spilled it. So I asked if he had any trouble, and he simply shrugged. I looked around the garage while he was gone and saw no traces of an oil spill. So whatever had happened, he must have gotten it all on himself and none anywhere else, miraculously. But he seemed reluctant to talk about it, so I didn't press the issue, and we worked on throughout the day. That day and the next were relatively normal, other than him still being awkward and quiet. I asked him if he'd like to go out and get us lunch while I tended the shop, and he said sure. When he came back, I was busy doing paperwork, so he put the food on the counter in the office to wait for me, and then went ahead and ate. I finished up with a customer. We'd have to keep her car overnight to figure out just why it kept dying on her. So I asked Neil to give her a ride home, and then went to grab my food. He brought me some Chinese food and an iced tea. So I opened the soy sauce packets to pour some over my meal when I noticed the strangest thing. It was as if the soy sauce was a living thing somehow, spreading out like dozens of squirming, inky black maggots when it fell into the fried rice, burying itself inside. I took the fork and started to scoop out the rice to look deeper. Small, smoky tendrils rose from the rice occasionally and dissipated. I was incredibly hungry at that point, but way too creeped out to eat that, so I chucked it and the iced tea in the garbage. I decided I'd just wait till I got home that evening to eat something I'd prepared with my own hands. I'd never in my life seen anything remotely like that, and I couldn't even fathom how I would ask Lewis if he'd noticed anything similar. As cold and distanced as he'd been lately, I was sure he'd look at me like I was Looney Tunes, so I just shut up about it. That Friday, we went down to the old watering hole, as we always do, to get some drinks and watch the local bands play. Lewis was just as quiet as he was all week. He's not a bad-looking fellow, though, and so despite him not really going out of his way to speak to anyone, a woman went over to where he was sitting and started talking to him. They ended up leaving together that night. Monday morning, I tried breaking the ice by asking how his weekend went. He gave me a nod and muttered all right. I asked him if he got lucky with that young woman I saw him with, and he gave me the smallest grin, which was quite possibly the first one I'd seen on his face in a week. It went well, he said. I didn't pressure him for details. I knew he'd share if he chose to, and his small grin was enough to assuage my worries and lend me some hope that he might get back to his old self soon. The day was busy until about 3 p.m. I had a spare moment in the office listening to the radio with a cup of coffee. So there I was, in my chair with my feet propped up on my desk, when I looked in my drawer. I remembered I had a few Garfield, Tom and Jerry, and Looney Tunes comic books. I opened them up, but what I saw was bizarrely and creepily different. The comic panels seemed normal, but from the second or whatever it went to, they had a blackish dark color, and the characters had long black tentacles coming out of their body, along with black bleeding eyes. Each of the comics said creepy things, such as, "It comes." I sat shocked at the comics. Then the most horrific thing happened. The blood started slowly flowing towards my finger, and the characters were looking directly at me. I threw myself away from the desk, left the office, and yelled for Lewis. I could not be the only one seeing this. To my surprise, he had gone, and so I hesitantly walked back to the office and peered inside. The comics were still corrupted, but they no longer appeared to be moving. I crept over to them and reached out to pluck one of the comics free when I noticed the blood coming towards my finger again, only faster. I jerked my hand away. Nothing good could possibly come from letting that blood touch my skin. Of course, I ripped the entire bulletin board down, burned it in a tin trash can out back, and never spoke of it again. That night, I went home and my wife was already in bed, fast asleep. My mind was racing, and I couldn't even bring myself to eat dinner that night. With no one to vent my worries to, I fell into a restless sleep and kept awaking to nightmare after nightmare seemingly every hour of the night until I just gave up on sleep entirely. That Friday, I went to the bar again. Even though my wife couldn't drink, being pregnant and all, and Neil wasn't really any fun to hang with anymore, and none of my other friends could seem to be reached. I just needed to get a good buzz, and I'd start feeling better. After downing a couple beers, I excused myself to the restroom when I noticed I was more inebriated than I'd estimated, so I leaned over the sink to splash some water onto my face. That's when I heard it. Like a sheet of fabric being dragged across the floor. A voice rasped ever so quietly out of the drain. It sounded like a prolonged exhale for the longest time, until I finally recognized words hidden among all those vowels. It comes. Cracks appeared in the porcelain, snaking out from the ring around the drain. At least they looked like cracks at first, but after a few seconds, I recognized them as the same blood coming from the comics earlier that week. I slowly ran out of the bathroom and into someone's chest. I turned around and stared up into the pitch-black eyes of a 6.5-foot biker with tattoos covering every piece of exposed skin besides his hands and head. I stumbled quickly away from him. His evil, piercing gaze followed me as I retreated through the bar. It felt like a dream, where whenever you're running for your life, it feels like running through quicksand. As I walked across the room, I noticed the biker wasn't the only one staring at me. It seemed every pair of eyes in the place were focused on me, and more than half of those eyes appeared to be perfectly black, with no hint of iris or sclera. Few lips moved, and though I couldn't hear their voices over the sound of the jukebox, I could easily guess what they were saying. It comes. I went home, but things only got more scary. When I went in my room, my computer was on for some reason. PowerPoint was open, and a sentence had been written by someone. It said, "To invoke thy father that kills our naughty children." It, what waits under the bed. I was confused and scared. The only question I had was, what the hell is this? But things didn't stop there. When I closed PowerPoint, there was a strange file downloaded. It was called ic.exe. I opened the file. There were 6 images, and they were disturbing. They were edited photos of Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Garfield, Tom, Jerry, and Odie, with black bleeding eyes and tentacles, with all of them saying the words, "It comes." I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. I haven't been getting much sleep for the past couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, which I'm guessing those of you who have spoken to me recently could have guessed. I keep seeing those pitch black eyes staring at me. I'm afraid everyone I see will turn and whisper those words to me, staring deep into my soul with that evil glare. Every time I go near a sink, or go to grab a bite to eat, I'm afraid I'll see the blood coming out. Even my wife has seemed cold and distant lately. Then, tonight as I'm driving home from work, struggling to keep my eyes open so that I don't drift into oncoming traffic, my cell phone rang and it was my wife. She was on her way to the hospital to have our baby. For the first time in 2 weeks, I was actually happy. She was in the labor room, strapped to a monitor when I got there, watching her for contractions. She barely noticed when I walked in, but didn't seem startled when I sat down beside her and took her hand in mine. I tried talking to her, but she was unresponsive. And I was so tired, I didn't even realize I had started to drift off to sleep until the nurses came in and started moving her to the delivery room about a half hour later. I put on my scrubs and a hairnet and went in with her to hold her hand and coach her through like they trained us in Lamaze when she started cursing and screaming. I was prepared for that, as well as her ever-tightening grip on my hand. But when I saw the movement in her tummy, my mind started to reel. The doctor said the baby was crowning and told her to push. I echoed his orders, and she screamed at me with a voice I couldn't begin to describe. When I looked down at her, she was staring up at me with those same eyes I'd seen on the biker. The same eyes I thought I'd seen on Lewis weeks before. I tried to jerk my hand away, but she maintained her grip. Black, tar-like blood splashed the front of the doctor's scrubs, but he seemed to pay no heed. When I looked at her tummy again, black veins seemed to stand out beneath her skin, pulsating. She continued to stare at me, and she was no longer screaming, just grinning, those obsidian eyes boring into me. To invoke thy father that kills our naughty children. It, what waits under the bed, she said. It what waits under the bed, in a palace of tortured fire, served by legions forged from the tears of the sleepless dead, the doctor said. He stared down at the child, my child, lying silently, cradled in his blood-stained hands. He looked up and raised the baby, and it appeared to be covered in blood, exactly the same way as the comics were. It did not cry out, but it was alive, and it moved when he held it up. When its eyes opened, they were as black as my wife's, as black as the doctor's. In unison, they all breathed his name. El Coco. I ripped my hand free of my wife's iron grip and stumbled out of the room, barreling into the nurses passing in the corridor just outside. When I stood up and looked back into the room, I could see the blood seeming to extend from the doctor and my newborn across the floor to where I stood. I turned and ran down the hall to the elevator and slammed my finger into the buttons. When I looked back, the blood had come into the hallway until it slithered over their feet and up their legs, at which point they abruptly stopped, turned, and looked at me with those same obsidian eyes. I abandoned my effort to call the elevator and broke into a panicked run for the stairs. I ran down the 15 flights all the way to the lobby, tore ass out into the parking lot, hopped in my car, and started driving. I didn't know where the hell I was going. I just had to get the hell out of there. I don't know if I'm going crazy. It certainly seems like it. But I just can't be around anyone I know anymore. They all have those same eyes, and those same dead stares. And even my child. Oh God, my baby. I still saw those eyes staring at me from the cars beside me. By some strange coincidence, the same biker from the previous Friday night at the bar pulled up beside me an hour away from the hospital and followed me for nearly 2 miles. He'd turn and stare at me, grinning. I couldn't see his eyes through his sunglasses this time, but I knew it was the same guy. His tattoos seemed to move of their own free will. The flaming skull on his right bicep began bleeding from its eye sockets. As soon as I could, I slammed on my brakes, allowing him to fly past me as I swerved to my left and did a U-turn. I think I lost him, and that was about an hour ago. I'm at a motel 3 hours out of town, the first place I found that had Wi-Fi. I'm tired and shaking, and my hand itches where my wife's nails scratched me open. I honestly don't know what to do, or who I can turn to. This story will sound insane. I'll probably be institutionalized. I'm not sure that wouldn't be the best thing for me, but I just can't bear to look into those eyes anymore. Every time I see someone new and they stare at me, I start to panic. Because I just know it's out there looking for me, whatever it is. And even when I lay down and start to drift off to sleep, I hear those words. It comes. There's something fascinating and powerful about oral tradition and folklore. Long before the days of internet, cell phones, and social media, stories were passed from person to person. Maybe a small group sitting around a campfire, or in a house listening to a storyteller. Then those stories passed to the next group, and the next, circulating, while also taking on a life and vibrancy of their own. The legend of El Coco spans hundreds of years, thousands of miles, and millions of people, to elicit fear in the one child who runs to bed and pulls the cover over their head and refuses to look in dark corners to avoid catching a glimpse of the monster. That kid was me. That monster was El Cuco. And to this day, I'm not entirely convinced he's just a myth. He could be real. And he could be watching you right now, waiting for a chance to strike. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. What makes El Cuco so damn scary? And does he really snatch unruly children? Or is he nothing more than an urban legend? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.